Welcome to the Engine Room Podcast, where host Coach Aaron Sloan and Julie Watson explore the world of boxing through the lens of sport, culture, and science from the Engine Room Boxing Gym in the heart of downtown Tulsa. Our guest today is Dr. Brian Coleman. Dr. Coleman is the director of the Family Medicine Residency and the Sports Medicine Program at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center in Oklahoma City. His areas of expertise include endurance athletes, musculoskeletal ultrasound, combative sports, and sports medicine injuries. Outside of work, Dr. Coleman is an avid runner who has completed marathons in every state. He also serves as ringside physician for as many combat sports as time allows, including wrestling, boxing, and MMA.
Welcome to the Engine Room Podcast, Brian.
Thank you. Great to be here. I'm excited to do this.
Really glad you came on with us today. Our listeners, the obvious focus that we want to talk to you is because you're a combat sports doctor here in Oklahoma. So that's the thing that stands out the most for our listeners, but they might not understand a lot about what you actually do. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do just on a day-to-day basis? And
You bet. I work in Oklahoma City at the Health Science Center at OU, and am the Family Medicine Residency Director and the Sports Medicine Fellowship Director. So I do family medicine most of the time, and then in all my spare time, I do as many sports events and coverage and things with athletes as possible.
do you do other, do you do football or basketball or anything like that, or is it just primarily the combat sports?
I do a little bit of everything. Work with some of the local high schools and small colleges, and when tournaments come to town, I work with the chamber occasionally to help cover events and things like that with them.
I see.
I was just going to say, I'm kind of curious about how you got into that. I think you are an endurance athlete. I know we looked at that a little bit in reading about you. And how did you get into that? I mean, sports medicine and way specifically your interest in combat sports.
Well, that's interesting. When I went to medical school, I knew that I wanted to do and stay involved with sports somehow. I was fortunate enough to play in ADA when I was growing up and was all about sports all the time. And then in college, I got to play a little bit at a small college. And when I went to med school, I knew I wanted to stay fit, or at least working with patients that wanted to be fit. And then just kind of was fortunate enough to have a mentor that I met the second week of medical school who had kind of helped guide me into sports medicine a little bit. And then just by the desire to cover things and the willingness to say yes when people ask if they need help covering events or anything like that. I love going to them and covering them, and it's a good way to get a good seat if you get to cover them. So
I know from an amateur boxing standpoint, I mean, we really appreciate you guys when you do that. So it's so hard for us to find doctors for amateur boxing. And that's one of the biggest hindrances to us to be able to do more shows and to get these kids more fights and to put on more tournaments, because the doctor is usually the hardest thing to find. Next, and then the officials, and then the boxers are always easy to get, and the coaches, because we're all eager to do it all the time. But it's with just a scheduling problem and finding enough doctors to do our shows. It's really hard. So we really appreciate that from your all's field.
It really can be. And actually, I've been fortunate enough. One of the emergency room docs in Oklahoma City kind of led me to. There's kind of a main Tulsa fight doc and a main Oklahoma City guy in the state, it seems, and the Oklahoma City guy kind of let me cover with him several times, and then they kind of started calling me to cover fights and do that, and I just love it. It's always a bummer during football season if I'm covering football games and they have events that I don't get to cover.
Yeah.
Friday nights are a big night for fights and such, so it's a bummer. But I actually am going to get for the first time this year, because of the pandemic and stuff, I'm going to get to attend the Association of Ringside Physicians Conference and get the whole, assuming I can pass the test, the qualifications and the certification to be a formal ARP doctor. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, I've seen when they've did those conferences, and the turnout's really great at those. So
yeah.
Have any of your residents, they must find it pretty intriguing that you do that. Are any of them interested in learning about that as well, beyond just sports medicine?
They are, and when you cover fights, it's a lot better to have a team rather than just one person, because then you can check on guys or gals in between fights or during other fights, and you still have a couple at ringside. So I kind of use it as an opportunity to expose residents and trainees to as much of it as I can. I usually take anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 guys or girls with me to cover and to see the events, and several of them have gotten really involved. One of the guys from 2 years ago is now down in Houston and has already joined with their group and is covering fights down in Houston. So,
yeah, that's fantastic.
Was it a pretty steep learning curve? Obviously the basics of being a physician are the same, but it seems really specific to the ring and what you're being called on to do at those fights, or what you're supposed to be aware of or looking for.
It is. And interestingly, even different, MMA versus boxing, they have different when you can go into the ring, when you have to be outside the ring, who can touch the fighter first, and all that kind of stuff. And even some of the kickboxing and jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai all have very subtle differences and rules as to when the doctor can touch them versus the official versus those type things. And it's still a learning curve for me to cover some of the different nuances and the different types and styles of combat sports.
Well, I'm sure, with me just primarily been from a boxing background, the obvious focus that everybody looks at is the head injury, of course, from taking blows. But I guess with MMA, there's a whole different area you have to kind of think about too, with joint manipulation and different kinds of injuries that can be sustained with that sport that you might not normally see in a boxing match.
Absolutely. And it actually, even the physical we do pre-bout changes just a little bit. We always have our MMA guys do a couple extra things as far as crab walk and those type things that we don't even necessarily have the boxers do, just because they're not going to be down in a grappling stance, hopefully, or any of that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, it's definitely a slightly different thing that you look for and working with those guys.
Well, some of these guys will have a little injury and they try to get by with hiding it from you sometimes too. So
absolutely.
Make sure they go to the ring. So
absolutely. One of my favorite stories, and I was telling one of the commissioners the other night, I used to have a fighter that did some MMA and some boxing, and I personally watched him get TKO'd 4 or 5 times. And every time on his assessment form, he would always say 0 concussions. And I finally said, hey, I've seen you get at least 2. So I know there's and it's just kind of funny, but it's hard to stress to those folks the importance of head injury and watching for it and making sure that you give yourself adequate time after bouts to recover if that is to occur and that kind of stuff.
Kind of makes me want to lead into some of the questions I had about what are the injuries you see most in boxing?
It seems to me in boxing more often, which I was really surprised with the heavier, thicker gloves and things like that. But to me, there's many more cuts to certainly the eyebrows, that kind of stuff than I really expected in boxing. A lot more facial cuts and things like that. And some of it comes from headbutts or even elbows coming across. But I was really surprised by that. You do see some concussive type things. Again, I haven't done a lot of 12 and 15 round bouts, or 10 to 12 round bouts. Just because most of the fight cards around have somewhere between 4 or 6 or 8 rounds. So I haven't seen some of the longer term concussive type fights. But to me, it seems more that it's been, knock on wood for me as the doc, it's been more cuts and then occasionally broken hands and things like that. I did have one, the gentleman threw his shoulder out of socket on the first punch of the night. He I think it was a left jab, and his shoulder just came out of socket. kind of ended the bout pretty quick. But for the most part, it's all upper extremity or head type stuff in boxing.
But I know, there's a lot of differences between. I have pro fighters, of course, and I've trained a lot of pro fighters, but primarily what we do is amateur boxing. We're USA Boxing sanctioned gym, so we're dealing with headgears and things like that most of the time. So you don't see as many cuts. But the thing that's striking between the amateur sports and the professional world is, and the amateur side, I think we see a lot less injuries and things because, for one, we do standing 8 counts. So if somebody gets hit hard, the referees will step in and give them an 8 count to recover. Where that usually doesn't happen in the pros until you get knocked down. And then the gloves, I can compare the gloves even with the equipment. A 10-ounce amateur boxing gloves, just a lot more cushion on the knuckles than a professional fight glove would be. And then I just think the mentality is a little different. As the rounds get longer, it becomes easier to have a mismatch. In amateur boxing, with 3 rounds, if those guys are mismatched, it usually shows up right away. So that fight's going to be stopped, and they don't have to go as long to where they get fatigued and start getting helpless in the ring. And that's where I see the danger in the pro sports more from my standpoint, is when the guys start getting, one guy tires out before the other one and he starts becoming helpless just from a conditioning standpoint. It really shows how important it is to get it, if you're going to get in that ring, to be in phenomenal shape, because I think that's one of the main things that can keep you safe.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And it's interesting. And the thing that I'm sure with your amateurs, you guys don't encourage quite such the weight pulls, which automatically makes guys get into the ring sometimes behind the 8 ball and that kind of stuff. Most of them do. And I don't know when all of the amateurs, I think you guys do weigh-ins probably day of event. And some of the professionals, when they weigh in a day or so early, and then they have time to be really dehydrated so that they can make weight, but then they try to come back up. It just doesn't. They're already going in kind of, as I said, behind the 8 ball, or a little bit fatigued and not in their peak shape.
Yeah, I've never been a fan of the cutting weight. We keep our amateurs pretty close, and yeah, they do have to weigh in, every day. But particularly if you go to a tournament in amateur boxing, and like a Golden Glove Nationals or one of our national competitions, if you continue to advance through those tournaments, you have to be at a weight you can make every day that you box. So you don't get just to blow up and then forget about it like you would in the pro fight. And it's weight cutting's hard, and it's hard for them to get under control. And they went to that day before weigh-in to try to make it safer. But, the boxing mindset, these guys just decided to try to pull more weight since they had a whole day to rehydrate, So
right.
I've tried to deal with that, and I've had people ask me questions before. I almost wish they would do like a random weigh-in, like they would a random drug test at some of the levels where, you have a guy just shows up to your house with a scale, and,
right.
weeks out from the fight, if you're not on weight, then
well, I've tried to do that a little bit with, the college wrestling and high school wrestling, as far as doing some caliper measurements for body fat, and some, if you weigh 150 when school starts, you don't get to wrestle at 125 that year.
Sure.
You have to have started your weight cuts and getting closer before, doing that kind of stuff. So they've tried to do some of those things at the college and high school level, and I think it's helped. I still am impressed or scared or saddened by how much weight people can pull in a day or two just to make weight. I was fortunate. I got to talk to a UFC guy one time that his fighting weight was 170, but he liked to walk around at about 220 before, like in between his camps. And when camp started, he would try to start his pull, and the last parts of his deal, he would get down around 170, which just, I can't imagine that, doing that to your body.
It's just too much. And it affects their performance. It's hard to get them in that mindset to believe that it doesn't. But the really confusing part to me is, that frustrates me, is both guys are doing it. I'm like, if you're both doing that to each other, why don't you just stop and fight at a higher level, but
right.
both do it to themselves. So, and some of it I think's become, it's kind of like a old tradition of hazing in college or something. It's almost becomes a pride thing to see where they can say how much weight they've cut for a fight or something. It's kind of in the culture of the sport a little bit too, I think.
For sure. Yeah, I would agree.
It kind of makes me thinking of you as a physician and sort of the ethical issues around, and I'm not saying this is an unethical thing in any way, but there's a little bit of balance between your focus as a physician on keeping people healthy and arguably by many people's, standards, a very dangerous sport when you talk about combat sports. Now, that can be argued. I think, football versus boxing, that's an interesting topic too. But just from your physician standpoint, is that sometimes troubling to work through, or do you have those conversations with your residents about what your role is?
We actually have that a lot. I think it was 5 years ago at the AMSSM, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine. We actually had a 3-hour seminar done on kind of that very thing of, should we as this sports medicine body support these things, and should we not? And they kind of do it to pull out different nuances, but my mentor I can't even get him to come along and join in the fun and go with us. He just doesn't agree with it. But my feeling is, one, I really enjoy the sport. But two, they're going to do it. And I would prefer that someone that enjoys the sport and still cares for the athletes and has an interest in what's going on to be there to at least try to help out and not that there's a whole vast knowledge in my brain, but to help out guys and to try to lead in the right direction, if you will. As far as, my feeling is they're going to do it. They're going to fight. They're going to box. They're going to have MMA things. So it's best to have physicians and coverage by people that know what they're doing and that have the best interest of the fighters at hand, but also enjoy and can respect the sport and what's going on.
That's interesting because you gave the exact same answer I think that I normally give. And when people ask me, they'll ask me the same thing because I'm a nurse, or, how do you get close to these kids when they're small and then you see them go up and be a fighter? And I just tell them, well, anytime they want to go fill out a FAFSA for college, I'd rather go do that. But as long as they're going to box, I'm there because I do care about them. I'm there to make sure that, they have a coach that I know is educated about what we do and that take their safety seriously and try to be the best I can for them while they're getting in the ring. And sometimes I'm a little less, politically correct with it. And, I get a little irritated sometimes even when people ask me the same question that we just asked you. And I just point blank tell them, well, you took a bigger chance driving here in the car to ask me that question than what most of these guys do when they get in the ring. And, so I agree with you 100% that we need good people in this sport that want to keep these guys safe, because to me, it's in some ways it's almost equally as bad to turn your back on some of these sports and just let them go. I mean, and then who do you have there to make sure that they're safe? So.
Right. And I tend to really try to focus on that with the kids. And I still think and you mentioned the political side, I'll try not to do any of that, but I think that combat sports are one of the best ways to, for lack of a better word, toughen kids up and get them ready for what's going to happen in the real world, and just teaching them that ability to push through and to be resilient and that type stuff, and to keep yourself and your body in the best shape it can stay in, and things like that. And team sports football is great. I am got my fantasy team going on now and all kinds of fun stuff. But to me, the combat sports, wrestling, I wrestled until I was a sophomore in high school and got too skinny and just got bent like a twig. So I didn't feel like that was my calling anymore. But I really think that those kind of sports really can ingrain the discipline that it takes to continue and to do those things.
Well, they put the burden back on the athlete. It's a one-on-one. I tell most of my guys, if they get beat, most of the time it's not because you're not any good. It's because the other guy was more experienced. And so it's an honor to compete with somebody even when they beat you, and you have to learn from those lessons and understand that they were more experienced than you, and that's how you're going to get your experience. And most of the time in boxing, and you've seen it in MMA, I mean, these guys have so much respect for one another, and it's not this. Neither one of those guys most of the time want to hurt each other.
Right.
I've had a boxer tell me one time, well, yeah, I always hugged a guy and everything after the fight because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have had a fight, and it comes back to the same thing. If like doctors, if we didn't have you, we wouldn't have had matches. I mean, we always joke and say, well, the ring's up and the doctor's here. So now we know we're going to have some fights, So I think it's a much more humble sport than I think what a lot of people would think.
I would agree with you. And it's that same thing. I think they respect the work the other person has put in to be there with them.
Sure. It's a lonely sport when you're training in the gym. People only see you for the few minutes you're in the ring, and they don't see you for all the hours that these guys spend inside the gym and the things that they give up in order to come and, try to entertain and do their hobby for, an amateur boxing. If they're lucky, they're fighting 3-minute rounds. They're there for 11 minutes and that's it, so it's and a lot of times we've driven all the way across the country to get them there. And they get to spend 11 minutes worth of time in the ring, and, but I love the sport and they love it and it's worth it to me, so.
Absolutely. There's a lot more than that 11 minutes in the training that goes into it, though.
Yeah,
so.
When you start thinking about that and the flip side of that, injury prevention or recovery, do you have advice on that in general? I mean, I feel like that's partly the coach's role as well as it is the individual athlete's role. Do you have any thoughts on, especially maybe specific to boxing or combat sports versus other sports?
Yeah, and I think that's always hard because it's hard to know each individual's body. I think, kids tend to bounce back a little quicker at a younger age. So it's sometimes it's hard, and it almost has to be an individualized thing as to how long certain people should be out, given, either the fight or the training plan, that kind of stuff. And, with all of the wearable devices and all of the stuff that people have now, and as far as, my heart rate when I slept last night was in the 50s, that means I didn't get to rest quite as much as I should have. It should be a little lower. So I think a little bit of that is a personal feel for how long it takes to get better and to recover, depending on the workload. But, I think after events and to be able to monitor head stuff is really the biggest thing to be able to recover from. If they've had a concussion, stuff like that, to make sure that it's been given time to recover fully and that their focus is back either on their schoolwork or their job or whatever else is going on before they start looking to get head injured or any of that kind of stuff again. And, I think with the cardio side of it, again, to me, that's a little bit, it's one of those things, do you push yourself when you're already a little bit tired, which is really a good idea as far as working on how your metabolism works and moving to a little bit more fat metabolism and things where you can do longer energy expenditures and things, but to not completely overtrain where you're just exhausted all the time. So it's kind of a fine balance of pushing that envelope to make yourself better, but not overtraining to where you can't recover and let those improvements happen.
Well, on that topic too, I think a lot of that burden from an educational standpoint needs to come from the coaches. I've had fighters from all different calibers, from people that maybe just want to get in to do a couple novice amateur boxing matches, to national ranked guys that we've fought with. You can always kind of tell. Most boxers, it takes some coaching and some push to drive people to do things. But some of these guys, that really that I've seen excel, you almost have to pull the leash on them a little bit instead of stoking their fire, and it's always fun to train a guy like that. But to me, when you have that level of athlete, you have to be a little more proactive as a coach and make sure that since you're not using that energy to get these guys to train, you got to use your energy to make sure that they recover. And that when I see I have a boxer like that, then I have to spend that time to make sure that they actually get the rest and things like that they need. And back to the weight cutting, the weight cutting is not just a problem to the fights. We forget a lot of times in this sport, unless you're a super heavyweight, everybody is worried about their weight. And I've noticed that, a little, it stood out to me a lot, especially even more so in the MMA than the boxing, because I think a lot of those guys come from that wrestling background where they even cut weight as kids. The weight issues, I don't know a good way to say it, but it's more odd to me to see that in the male row of people being so concerned with the male, when it comes to the male athletes about their weight. They worry about it all the time. And so I see a lot of the guys in the gym, even they're basically training dehydrated if you don't watch them, because they'll work out one day and then they won't hydrate back up the next. And I think some simple things like daily weight checks and stuff, sometimes if you notice an athlete like that, is a good way to keep them from getting overtrained, because that overtraining syndrome that comes from not staying properly hydrated, that just adds up super quick with these guys.
It sure does. And just like you said, the nutrition is a huge key, especially if you're looking at junior high and high school kids and even college age, where really you're still building muscle mass as well. And it's natural to move up weight classes in high school age kids, because that's when people grow. And, the struggle sometimes that they see to stay smaller and to, because there is some benefit also to putting on muscle and moving up a weight class if you're Absolutely. Putting on muscle and getting more fit and in shape. The other ones that I've seen it is with gymnasts, because they have to have such a strong upper body and core to weight ratio. One of my roommates in college was a gymnast, and he was all about his strength to weight ratio, as far as, the whole, how many pull-ups can you do and all that. So that it was kind of the same thing. Really, really, really watched his weight, and almost to the eating disorder type thing.
Well, it's an interesting point you touched on, because it's an anomaly with, I think, almost any sport. Every sport you can think of, we start these kids when they're super early, and there's a lot of talk about it. Are we starting them too early? And in boxing, they can start competing when they're 8. So that means they start training when they're 6 or 7. Over my 11 years of coaching, I've just never had a kid that young that I took to the ring. It was just by happenstance. I didn't have any boxers that young. Most of them usually been about 10 or 11, and I think that's probably a better age for boxing. But there's no manual out there or literature on how to train a kid. There's no studies. They don't do studies on kids. So we have all these training resources and this education that we get how to train athletes, and they're all adults. There's nothing about, when these kids are hitting growth spurts or how much more sleep do they need, or, what should a training time be when we know they're having to do school and homework and all of those kinds of things. When should you make them lift weights and when should you not? I've got a lot of things that I've done just from experience that I've adapted with my younger athletes, but there's no standard out there for that.
Right. And that's a true point that's hard to mention. When do you start lifting weights, and how much weight do you put on the bar for kiddos that are not really in their pubertal stages and stuff like that, before the age of about 13 or, freshman year in high school, that kind of stuff. And because no matter how much weight they can lift, it's not really muscle mass. It's more of a training of those muscles to do it until there's some other hormone type stuff going on and things like that. So, no, I think that's a good point. And one of the things I've always encouraged people is and it's not, especially living in Oklahoma City area where the schools really push it, but is I'm not a giant sports specialization fan. Like, if the kid wants to play football and baseball and box on the side, and next week he's going to play golf and that's what I think kids respond best to. I think it makes them better overall athletes. And again, the time in combat sports is perfect to help them work on their resilience and their well-being by themselves, so that they can figure out what it feels like to put in the work and to do that on a solo thing. But I also, like I said, any sport kids ask me to play, I try to kind of push them into and encourage that for them.
I was talking to a I don't want to interrupt if Julie has any other questions on that, but that you're hitting on so many things that just came up. I had a conversation with a Canadian Olympic coach for the boxing team there, and they were winning a lot in the, North America, but when they were going overseas, they were getting beat. And so they hired all these different types of coaches, the professional baseball, football, basketball coaches, to come in and evaluate their overall training program. And the feedback they got was, well, you have a lot of really great boxers, but you have really horrible athletes. And his response was, well, these are some of the top level boxers in the world. How could they be horrible athletes? And they're like, well, they can't even they can't do an agility ladder. They can't do this many push-ups. They just couldn't do very athletic things. And I think that happens a lot with a sport like boxing, to where, a lot of times with boxing, we get the kids that are kind of, the leftover off the street, or they washed out in the team sports, or maybe they just started too late. If you wait till you're 13 or 14 years old to start baseball, you might as well give it up. I mean, you're already so far behind, you're not going to compete at a high level usually. So we get those kids like that, and they're not great athletes because they haven't been through that structure. They haven't been coached before. And all they did was start making them play flag football, and they started making them play basketball games with each other and doing basketball drills. And their win percentage went up to like some crazy number, like 30-something%. I mean, that's all they did. They didn't work on anything that was boxing related, because those things were so intricate and small to measure, but the things on the athleticism side just made a huge wave of difference on improvement.
Right. That's interesting. That's a cool thought. I hadn't heard of that. But.
Yeah, they just couldn't do some of the simple balance and, the reaction time
right.
from those other drills just wasn't there. So
I was wondering, I think you have a really unique perspective on the sport, both as a physician and someone who wrestled and just someone who loves the sport. And having gotten a little bit into this, I think there's a lot of misconceptions, particularly about as an amateur sport. And have you seen that? Are there things that you find yourself explaining to people, or that you perceive that might be misconceptions in general about participating in this sport?
In boxing in particular?
In particular, but maybe in general combat sports, because I think MMA is something a lot of people recognize maybe. Combat sports in general.
And you mentioned me as a wrestler. I wrestled till I was a sophomore. I don't think I would ever call myself a wrestler. Those guys are, again, that's a different breed of respect that I don't know if I was ever up to it. My buddy that wrestled would challenge the thought that I was a wrestler. But, I think that there's definitely a misconception as far as, especially with amateur type bouts and things like that, all some people think of is Rocky, where they just let them go until neither one of them can stand, and they're both just bloodied, opponents laying down on the floor, can't stand, that kind of stuff. Whereas, as you were mentioning in amateur boxing, there's headgear, there's gloves that are different weight. It's much more of a scoring system, the standing 8 counts, and it's done in an extremely safe manner. With guys like Aaron to oversee it and to watch it and to make sure things are done right and that the scoring is done well, that I definitely think there's a misconception as far as we're not putting, 2 12-year-olds out there just to see who can be the last man standing. That's not what happens. And I do agree that I think that's probably some of when you say, oh, I'm putting my kid in boxing class, or I'm going to take my kid to the MMA fights or do this or that, but I think that's probably what some people think of when you say that.
Well, I still get that question. I mean, we have the gym here. This is what I do. I mean, full time. And
congratulations! Looks like you guys got a new facility recently, right?
It's fantastic. We're so excited to have the extra room. So we just outgrown
awesome
space. But 95.5% of my business is people that just want to do boxing to get in shape, and they're not here to fight. But it's funny because I try to encourage people to come to the gym. A lot of times I'm like, well, come in and try it out, and they're like, I don't want to get hit. I'm like, no, you don't have to get hit just to participate in the sport. And I think that's been a problem with, with combat sports too. It's especially on the boxing side, we've alienated so much of the population by you go to, I've heard horror stories of people going to the boxing gym to try to learn how to box, just like you would martial arts or jujitsu or anything else. And they go in the boxing gym and so somebody puts them in the ring to spar because they think that's going to toughen them up, So we've kind of been our worst enemy in boxing as far as getting the sport to grow by having that kind of mindset put out there. But with me in the gym here, I encourage everybody to box. Anybody who would listen to this, I would encourage them to go to the boxing gym and box, because you can do it as a sport and you can take it serious and you can learn the technique and you can learn the defense part of it without ever having to get in the ring to spar or to get hit if you don't want to. So, you're your own person in the ring. So,
well, I looking through your stuff, saw, all of the boxing fitness classes and even the work with Parkinson's and that kind of stuff. And those are all things to keep your body moving. And that's the goal of what we do. And that's part of what I enjoy about being a sports medicine doc is telling people to stay active. And if you're doing 3,000 steps a day on your Garmin and you're overweight, well, then let's move it up to 4,000 and just keep your body in motion. And when people say, well, what can I do to stay active? Every single person I say, find what makes you happy.
Yeah.
And if finding a gym where you can go and punch a bag for an hour and dance around it and hit it and learn all the techniques and stuff, like you say, without being hit, and that's what people enjoy, that's awesome. I mean, it's great exercise. I took boxing at my freshman year in college, and I quickly found out I don't like being hit. So they made us they made us take we had to do a little sparring thing, and thankfully it was only 3 1-minute rounds, and it didn't take me all 3 rounds to figure out my face doesn't like to be hit.
Well, I think so. We, in our master's program, they do 3 1-minute rounds. And I almost think the 1-minute rounds are worse, because I think both guys are thinking, oh, it's only 1 minute, and they just come out and throw everything they can throw. And it's almost harder to go 1 minute than it is 3 sometimes. Because if you're going 3, both fighters have a little more respect for that, and they slow down a little bit and take their time. And when they think they only have 1 minute to go, they put you in a war right away, and you're dead tired after 1 round.
That's right.
So,
I think we're getting a little about closer to the end of the hour, and I did have a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you, you brought up something that's actually one of my favorite topics, and I know from medicine standpoint, so much of it is kind of fixing people after the fact, but I think you really do have a focus on exercise as a prescription, maybe, if that's the right way to say it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I truly believe that for mental and physical health, it's huge.
Absolutely. And, especially with the shutdown and everything that we've had, and gyms being closed and all that kind of stuff, I think the ability to find what it is that you enjoy doing, be it, you mentioned that I enjoy running. That's part of what I do. I've gotten where I do a lot more body weight type exercises as well with that. But to find what people like, I mean, you can't overstate enough how, one, it helps just your brain be healthier, keeps it more in sync, but blood pressure, cholesterol, weight, all those type things that really everybody struggles with, but Oklahoma in general, really struggles with some of those things. So like you mentioned, yes, it's preventive, but the hard part I've found is just to find what it is that makes it click for certain people. Some people don't want to walk 10 minutes a day, but if you can find something else they can do, elliptical for 10 minutes or some other type of exercise that they enjoy, then try to encourage that type thing, just because of the overall, yes, it can help your blood pressure, cholesterol, and weight, but like you said, it's a huge mental relief. I don't know if that's the right word, or kind of mental well-being, helping to get your thoughts organized for the day, that kind of stuff.
Well, I think that, from an exercise as medicine standpoint, that's what we've always encouraged, especially since I've opened the gym. I've never, I wouldn't say never, I've had a few times I do push some stuff because we do want to help people lose weight and stuff like that, but we've never made a habit of advertising to come in for 90 days, or I've never been a big, fan of pushing in January to get people to come in and lose weight. I'm trying to sell lifestyle modification, and I can do that by making people fall in love with boxing. So when they come here, I try to turn them into a boxing fan. I try to teach them the technique where they can understand it more when they watch it on TV, and get them to buy into the community, because I just believe if they want to be here and they feel like they're part of our community, the weight loss and exercise is going to be a side effect of that. And if I get people that come in and they join the gym, some things I tell them is almost counterintuitive, because I know that they need to stay here and get a habit first. So I tell them, they're like, what do I need to do on my diet? I'm going to do this. And I'm like, let's not worry about your diet right now. Let's get you in the gym and get you working out. Why don't we just say you're going to be here 3 days a week for, 60 days. And then let's go look at your diet, because people try to take on too much when they're trying to do this lifestyle turnaround, and they burden themselves so hard that it's almost impossible to follow through with. And then they just quit. So,
I think that's great.
I try to start them off slow and sell them on the program and get them to where they buy into the boxing and find something fun that they like to do. And the rest of it usually comes along with it. So,
yeah, I think that's awesome. And like you said, the fitness side of the gym is really cool. And learning, you mentioned kind of teaching them some of the stuff as far as scoring and when they watch boxing on TV, because those are the things that make it more important, and more palatable, if you will, for, whatever you're doing. If you understand what's going on and learn a little bit of the rules and all that, and then enjoy it, it makes it that much more fun to do.
You have another question?
I think you've been a great guest, and sorry we
fantastic.
Pick your brain. I have so many.
No, not at all.
I could keep you on it forever when we start talking about this. So
yeah, we'd love to bring you back sometime too, because I think there's so many things to explore at the sort of intersection of medicine and boxing, really, that not everybody realizes how much it plays into it. So
no, I would love to. This was enjoyable. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, thank you very much for coming on.
If people want to find out more about you and your practice, the OU Medical, what site should they go to?
That's a really good question. I think you just search my name on the OU Health Science Center or OU College of Medicine and Family Medicine. So
great. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Coleman. I appreciate you.
You bet. And anytime. I really enjoyed this. So appreciate it.
We'd love to have you back on soon.
All right. Y'all have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Engine Room Podcast with hosts Coach Aaron Sloan and Julie Watson, brought to you by Engine Management and Promotions. Our podcast today was produced and edited by Dylan Wagman. I'm Susan McKinney. The Engine Room Boxing Gym in Tulsa, Oklahoma offers competition and fitness training, as well as Ready to Fight Parkinson's-specific boxing. Designed by Coach Sloan, Ready to Fight is the official therapy boxing program of USA Boxing. For more information on all of our programs, visit engineroomboxing.com.